Story 1, The Driftwood Message. The shoreline was quieter than usual that morning. A pale mist clung low over the water, softening the horizon until the sea and sky bled into one another without distinction. The tide, half in retreat, had left behind a scatter of seaweed and shells that glistened under the muted light. In the distance, gulls wheeled lazily, their calls muffled by the thick, damp air. On days like this, the beach seemed reluctant to wake, as though it remembered some burden it would rather not face. It was while walking along this half-asleep coast that I saw it, a long piece of weathered driftwood wedged into the wet sand, the kind that could have been anywhere in the world before washing ashore here. Lodged in a knot along its side was something out of place. A glass bottle, cloudy with salt and age, its cork sealed in wax gone brittle and flaked. The bottle was heavier than expected when I lifted it, the glass chill against my palm. Inside, rolled tightly, was a piece of paper that had yellowed to the color of dried grass. The seal crumbled easily, and soon I was holding the note, my fingers brushing over handwriting that slanted slightly to the left. The message was brief, fewer than 20 words. It read, "Do not follow. We will not be here when you arrive. 14 July 2043, Greyford." I read it twice, the numbers refusing to settle in my mind. The year, 20 years ahead. I checked the back, searching for more, but there was nothing else. Just that date, that name. I might have dismissed it as an odd prank or a relic from some art project, but for the way the ink had bled into the fibers of the paper, the kind of wear that comes only from long exposure to salt and air. Whoever had written it, the note had been at sea a long time. A few steps further down the shore, caught among kelp, I saw something else. A leather-bound journal. The cover was darkened from water and warped at the edges, but the clasp was still shut, as though whatever was inside had been carefully protected. I didn't open it, not yet. Something about the way it felt in my hands made me think it wasn't mine to read, not yet. As I turned to head home, the mist was lifting, and for just a moment I thought I saw a man standing near the breakwater, tall, with a dark coat, leaning lightly on a walking stick. By the time I blinked, he was gone. I left the beach that day with the journal and the bottle, certain that neither had been meant for me, and yet unable to leave them behind. The bottle and the journal stayed on my kitchen table for the rest of the day, beading the varnish with little crescents of damp. I wiped them up from time to time without thinking, the way you might straighten a stack of letters that no longer need sorting. Rain threaded down the window in patient lines. The kettle breathed softly. The clock took its time. I told myself I'd set both finds on the shelf and forget them, but every glance seemed to bend back toward that clasped leather and the thin curl of glass. In the quiet, the date from the note refused to settle. It drifted through small tasks like a loose thread. July 14th, 20 years ahead. Greyford. When I caught myself checking the calendar, pointless, of course, I laughed under my breath, the sound too loud in an empty kitchen. I opened the window to let the sea's faint iodine smell in, and with it the soft thrum of distant water on stones. As the light grew thin and blue at the edges, I slid the journal closer and, after a small hesitation, unfastened the clasp. The first page had swelled slightly from salt air, the paper puckered in gentle waves like the shore it had travelled. Ink had bled through some lines and left others sharp. I expected a name, a dedication, but there was only a drawing. The curve of a coastline, sketched with a careful hand, and a small X on a narrow bay that could have been anywhere. In the margin, someone had written the word Greyford twice, as if to try it on the tongue, as if the sound of it was still uncertain. No dates, no owner. Between pages, a pressed sprig of sea heather had given up its colour and turned the paper faintly lilac. I read on. Some entries were no more than weather and wind, written in a compact script that leant left, just like the note. Others were longer, unspooling into small observations. The way fog hummed against the lighthouse lens, the way gulls fell silent just before the tide turned, names of fishermen and ferry hands, and one woman who brewed tea strong enough to hold a spoon upright. On one page, a single sentence stood alone, underlined without flourish. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. I closed the journal on that sentence and held it a moment, palms warm against the damp cover. Outside, a car passed on the small road, tires whispering on wet tar. The kettle began to hum again. I thought of the man by the breakwater, the tilt of his head, the quiet weight of the walking stick, and decided to go to the town library in the morning. Someone there, perhaps, would know a Greyford that wasn't only a word on paper. The library sat on a rise above the harbour, brick mellowed by salt and time. Inside, the air smelled of old glue and clean dust. Behind the desk, a woman with silver hair and a cardigan the colour of June grass glanced up and smiled with the kindness of someone who has lived in a place long enough to love its small forgotten things. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, feeling suddenly foolish. "I'm looking for anything on a place called Greyford. Town, county, river, anything." Her eyes moved, quick and thoughtful, the way a swallow turns in air. "We don't have a Greyford here," she said, "though I suppose names come and go. We have a Greystone, 2 coves with grey in them, and a family by that name once, I think. Why do you ask?" "I found a note," I said, and then, after a pause, "and a journal." I offered the book open to the sketched coast. She handled it gently, like one might hold a small bird. "This hand looks provincial," she murmured, half to herself. "Not old, but patient, the sort of notes a keeper might make." She looked up again. "Look in the local papers from 40, 50 years ago. There was a ferry route once that stopped when the new road came through. The old names clung to those timetables for longer than they should." We sat together at the microfilm reader, the spool turning with a steady tick. Headlines moved past like tides. There were pictures of summer fairs, the opening of a bakery, a storm that had torn shingles clear off the North Pier. I half forgot why I'd come, lulled by the parade of ordinary lives. Then, in a column near the bottom of an old spring edition, a small note. "Greyford ferry service temporarily suspended due to unpredictable tides." No photograph. No follow-up on the same page. In the list of harbour notices, a mention of bells carried inland by fog, puzzling farmers as far as the Mill Road. The librarian, her name tag read M. Ellery, tapped the line with a forefinger. "They used to say the sea took back what it wanted and when," she said quietly. "The ferry captain said the tide tables lied to him. I remember my mother telling me that. She said the bell sounded like a clock that had lost its hands." We sat with that for a moment, 2 small figures in a room made of pages. I copied the date, folded it into my pocket. As I left, Mrs. Ellery called after me, almost as an afterthought. "The old ferry road is still there, though the brush has grown up. It runs past the river bend where the cabin is. Folks still keep it stocked for anyone passing through." The afternoon had eased itself into a pale, uniform light by the time I reached the boundary where the village gave way to fields. The hedges were heavy with rain, drops gathered at their tips like beads. The narrow road unspooled in a generous curve and then straightened as it approached the river. You could hear it before you saw it, soft water talking to stone. The bend appeared with a kind of shyness, the cabin tucked close, roof dim under lichen, smoke hole patched with tin, door unlatched. Inside, the air held the clean smell of cedar. Shelves lined one wall, their contents spare but careful. A stack of folded blankets, a kettle, a tin of tea, a row of matches in a small glass jar. On the table, a guest book lay open, its pencil lying diagonally across the page. A hand, not the careful, compact hand of the journal, but another wider, had written only, "Thank you. Weather hasn't changed in weeks." No date. My fingertips, without meaning to, traced the words. I brewed tea and sat on the smooth bench by the window, listening to the river's even talk. watching the way small leaves released themselves from branches and skated the surface a little, like tiny boats with places to be. The cabin held quiet like a cup. Somewhere outside a thrush tried a few notes and then thought better of it. Evening slipped in gently, and I lit the lantern not because I needed it, but because its honeyed circle made the room feel held. I turned the journal pages while the lantern flickered. Between entries about barometer drops and the behavior of clouds at sunrise, two names recurred lightly, the way a tide repeats itself without effort: Ellery and Greyford. Once, in a list of small expenses, there was a line: tea at Mrs. Ellery's, 2 shillings. As if the past were determined to be itself, no matter how the years tried to sand it down. There was also a mention of a bridge inland, covered and old, that answers sometimes. The sentence ended there, as if the writer had been called away. I slept at the cabin, though sleep came in pieces, stitched together by the steady river. I woke once near midnight to a sound like a bell far off in fog. Not loud, not bright, only a small patient note that seemed to arrive not through the air, but through the wood of the bench and the bones of my hand. I listened until the sound faded and the river took up its soft counting again. In the morning, with tea warm inside me and a sense that the day wanted me to keep going, I followed the old ferry road as it threaded toward the coast. The hedges opened now and then to show a shoulder of sea or a field where hay lay in patient rows. It felt like walking through a book where the chapters had been bound in the wrong order, but the story still knew itself. At the harbour, I found the ferry dock weathered but sturdy, planks silvered from years of salt. A man sat on a coil of rope, his cap pulled low, the kind of posture that makes you certain he has always been there. He watched the water with a small smile that had more to do with patience than pleasure. When I asked about the ferry, he nodded toward the south, where the channel narrowed. "Used to be you could tell the tide by the way the gulls hung in the air," he said, voice flat and calm, like driftwood. "Then one summer the birds were wrong, the moon was wrong, the tables were wrong. Folks said it was something out at the shoals, but you ask me, it was just the sea deciding to remember itself." "Do the bells still carry?" I asked. "On windless nights," he said, glancing toward the inland hills as if he could see through them. "If you hear one on dry ground, it means you're listening right. Most don't, not anymore." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered booklet, the same size and shape as the journal's pages, though newer, less salt-worn. He held it out and I took it, half expecting blank paper. Inside, printed in neat type, were tide tables for the year, each day a pair of predictions, high, low, the hours between. At the bottom of the July page, someone had penciled a faint note: "Greyford, ignore." The handwriting had a familiar leftward lean. I looked up to ask, but the ferryman had shifted his gaze to the far spit, where fog gathered like wool. In its drifting border, a tall figure stood for a moment, coat dark, a walking stick angled lightly to the boards. The shape wavered. By the time I blinked the moisture from my lashes, the spit was empty again, only the fog settling on stones. He followed my look and said nothing. The weather held. It stayed softly overcast, as if the sky preferred its own company. In the tidy rhythm of small harbour life, the slap of rope against cleat, the mutter of engines, the clink of cups in the cafe, I felt that sentence from the journal hum under everything. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Not complaint, not warning, just a quiet record of a steady mood. I walked the shoreline to where the mouth of the river widened into the bay. The tide, if you could call it that, moved like a hand undecided between two gestures. The water tugged at itself, hesitated, and then reversed, as if remembering an appointment elsewhere. The few boats moored near the mouth had shifted their headings. Flags hung without interest. The air had that quality it gets just before a rain that decides not to fall. An older woman stood near the end of the breakwater in a navy coat mended at the cuffs. She kept her hands in her pockets and watched the subtle jostle of currents as if it were a play she knew the words to. I stood a polite distance away, and after a while she said, without looking at me, "It started the summer they closed the bridge inland. People blame the sea, but land remembers too." She nodded toward the hills. "You can hear the bell some nights, even here." "Which bridge?" I asked. "The covered one," she said. "The one that listens." She said it so simply that I found myself nodding as if this were natural. Then she smiled a little, as if she'd taken pleasure in having said something true without the need to be believed. "You'll want to see it," she said, "if you're the sort who keeps a journal." "I'm not the owner," I said, then stopped. Her eyes had fallen to the leather shape at my elbow. "No one is," she replied, not unkindly. "It keeps its own counsel." Evening returned me to the cabin by the river bend, where the journal and the tide tables lay side by side on the table like two polite guests waiting to be invited into conversation. I wrote a few lines on the back page. Notes, really, a list of names and dates and small things that felt larger inside the quiet. Ellery, Greyford, Ferryman's Pencil, Bell Inland, weather unchanged. When I lifted my hand, I saw I had adopted the same leftward tilt without meaning to, as if the posture of the earlier hand had taught mine a lesson while I wasn't watching. I slept again with the river's endless sentences, and at dawn, when the world had the soft colour of a mussel shell, I packed bread, filled the kettle, and set off inland along the road that would take me through the pines. The ferryman had told me it was the old road, the one people preferred when time was slower and the tides were trustworthy. He said I'd know the right turn by the way the trees leaned toward one another at the crown, as if whispering. He was right. The pines stood close and tall, their scent clean and resinous, and the road drew straight through them like a line drawn with a careful hand. The air grew cooler there, the sort of cool that has less to do with temperature than with a hush that falls of its own accord. Light fell in slats, the ground held it without glare. After a few miles, the sound of the river faded and was replaced by the delicate tick of needles falling. It is an odd thing to lose time without losing one's way. On that road, I walked as if in a thought I would be reluctant to leave. The trees were not identical. Some had lightning scars, some carried old nails from signs their bark had absorbed, but their patience made my steps match theirs. I had the distinct sense of passing the same patch of ferns twice, the same stone with a quartz vein like a pale seam. When I checked my watch later, I saw I had gained nothing or lost nothing. I couldn't tell which. Hours had opened and closed without ever needing me. At a small clearing, a wooden post stood with a nailed arrow pointing not toward any village I knew, but toward Greyford. The letters had softened with weather. Moss had begun to warm the edges. I traced them with a fingertip and turned where the sign suggested, the path narrower now, the pines making a soft ceiling overhead. A jay scolded once and then fell back into quiet. Somewhere ahead, water spoke a new language, shallower, quicker. I crossed a plank over a creek and came upon the covered bridge. It was older than it appeared at first glance, the timber dark with age, the roof shingles mended where storms had been unkind. Inside, the light gathered in soft pools along the floorboards, and the smell was of oak and silt and the iron tang of old nails. Names had been carved along the inner beams, not the leavings of travellers impatient to be seen, but the thin, careful marks of people who wanted only to say, "I was here without noise. I put my palm to the wood, and it returned my warmth with its own, as if a slow heart beat there. They say the bridge listens." I did not speak. After a few breaths, I realized it had been listening all the same, not to words but to footsteps, to the way a person carries themselves across. On that day it took mine into its old patient archive. I stood at the center, where the creek widened to a stretch clear enough to reflect the ribs of the bridge overhead, and in that stillness, from far away, or from the wood at my back, A quiet line rose. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Not a voice, not the trick of water, but a memory the place had kept and offered back in the tone of no one in particular. I answered in my head without meaning to, I know, and felt the oddest relief, the kind that comes not from being understood but from hearing the same sentence spoken twice in different lives. At the far end, under a beam with an old hand-forged spike, someone had tucked a folded paper. I hesitated, then drew it out. It was only a torn bit from a ferry schedule, the month of July circled, the 14th underlined. On the back, in pencil, the simplest of maps, a line from the bridge to a small square by the shore. Greyford was written there once, and then overwritten faintly, as if the writer had tried the word and then decided to trust the road instead. By the time I returned to the cabin that evening, the sky had softened into the kind of blue that asks nothing of the eye. I made tea, set the paper beside the journal, and considered the line from bridge to shore. The old ferry road, the vanishing hurry of tides, the inland bell, the weather's steady mood. Each small, quiet thread seemed to touch the other without knotting. In a corner of the journal, where the hand had left a margin open, I wrote only, bells inland, tide unsettled, bridge listens. Greyford everywhere. Night pressed itself gently against the windows. The river continued its patient, never-finished sentence. When the lantern guttered, I trimmed the wick and listened, and it seemed to me that somewhere beyond the bend, a ship's bell struck a single note that travelled as dogs do, good-naturedly, without urgency, over fields and hedges, to lay itself down next to the creek. It was not an omen. It was only sound remembering the shape of itself. In the weeks that followed, the weather refused to choose. Mornings wore a pale wool of cloud. Afternoons picked up a thin, bright edge and then let it go. The ferryman nodded when he saw me, as if I were a page he had remembered to turn. People in the harbour spoke of small things, fish runs and school feats, and sometimes in the pauses between someone would say, without looking at the sky, "Hasn't changed in weeks," and another would answer, "It will when it wants to." No one seemed troubled. The sea had her moods. The land kept its counsels. I began to suspect that Greyford was less a point on a map than a habit of certain places. The way a bell might carry, the way a bridge might keep a word, the way a journal might wash ashore, where it would be read by the person who needed not to own it, but to hold it for a while. And like all habits, it ran through more than one life. On a morning when the tide moved in shy inchings and then reconsidered, I turned the journal to a page near the centre that I had somehow missed. It was dated in a year not far from mine, though the hand had lightened as if the writer had grown weary of insisting on specifics. The entry read, "Hotel at the headland, one room unlisted, desk drawer stuck, rain on the window like thread." In the margin, Mrs. Ellery appeared again with a tiny asterisk beside it, as if nothing more needed to be said. I closed the book. Outside, a gull laid a line through the quiet air. Inland, the pines made their own weather. The old covered bridge waited on its creek, as if every day were the first day someone would cross it. Between shore and river, between the ferry's soft mutter and the bell's distant courtesy, it felt like time was pinning small notes to the same board, not to ask to be solved, but simply to be seen. That afternoon I packed the journal and followed the coast road north toward the headland, where an old hotel kept itself a little apart from the village. I did not hurry. There is no point in hurrying when the road has agreed to take you, and the tide has agreed to be undecided, and the weather has volunteered not to change. The chatter of hedgerow birds thinned as the wind from the sea made a low, even sound in the grasses. When the hotel came into view, stone softened by salt, windows tall and calm, it looked less like a building than like a pause the shore had taken. The desk clerk looked up from a ledger with the same mild acceptance I had met in the harbour and the bridge. There was a bell on the counter. It declined to ring. I asked if there was a room facing the sea, and the clerk smiled and slid a key forward on the smooth wood without numbering it. "Third floor," she said. "End of the hall. It's quiet there." The key was iron and old. It turned with a respectful resistance, as if the door wanted to introduce itself before letting me in. Inside, the air had the cool of stone and the faint perfume of beeswax. A tall window framed the bleached curve of beach and the thin line where sea held sky in place. A desk sat by the window, its drawer slightly ajar, and on the nightstand a small card with a line printed in tidy typeface. "We hope the weather changes for you soon." I set the journal on the desk and tried the drawer. It stuck on the first pull, then yielded an inch, then two, and then slid open with a soft acceptance. Inside lay a folded paper of the hotel's letterhead, blank, and beneath it, an envelope addressed to no one. I lifted the envelope and found it empty, except for a petal of sea heather, pressed flat and lilac faint like the one between the journal's pages. In the very bottom of the drawer, penciled along the wood where it would be hidden except to a person who had gone looking, was a single word, shaped in a hand that leaned left: Greyford. It did not feel like an answer. It felt like a breath held and then released quietly, as if to say, "We were here once and maybe again, but not when looked for." I set the envelope back, closed the drawer gently, and stood by the window as dusk unstitched itself. Sometime after the lamps came on in only two other rooms, one below mine, one across the courtyard, the fog drew a soft hem along the edge of the sea. Far inland, where the pines held their own sky, a bell struck once, and the hotel's old wood heard it and kept it, the way the bridge had kept footsteps, the way the ferryman kept his pencil note, the way Mrs. Ellery kept her patient kindness behind a desk on the hill. In that unhurried quiet, with the journal open to a page that held only a small drawing of a covered bridge and a creek, I let the day dim without closing it. The tide moved in its mild indecision. The gulls fell silent. The weather did not change. And somewhere on the empty breakwater, if I have remembered the angle of the fog correctly, a tall figure paused with one hand on a walking stick, not to be seen, only to know the hour by the sound that came eventually to find him. The air in the room had the stillness of a place that waited without expecting. From the tall window, the sea lay in its pale evening light, a muted silver where the horizon blurred, the kind of water that seemed to hold its breath. I stood a while, letting the weight of the old key rest in my palm, the shape of the iron bow fitting, as if it had been made for the hand of anyone who came here, though perhaps not kept by any of them for long. The desk drawer, now closed again, seemed to lean into the shadow as the lamp on the wall flickered faintly. Somewhere below, floorboards creaked with the sound of someone walking slowly down the hall, too far away to belong to my floor, yet close enough for the rhythm to make itself known. The steps faded, and I turned to the small table where the black leather-bound journal sat, its clasp now dull with salt-worn tarnish. I had left it unopened since arriving, as if the room itself wanted the pause. The journal seemed heavier here than it had in the cabin by the river bend, as though it absorbed the air and quiet around it. I thought again of the pressed sea heather in the desk drawer, its lilac ghost almost identical to the one between the journal's pages, though this one had been left with deliberate care on hotel stationery. These fragments, scattered across places that were never in conversation with each other, now seemed to share the same sentence. As the last daylight thinned, a sound came through the open pane. Faint, deliberate, and so steady I nearly mistook it for the heartbeat of the tide. It was not the usual clang of buoy bells or the sharper call of the harbour's warning chimes. This was a softer, more patient toll, carrying over the headland with the strange clarity that only comes when air is still. I stepped closer to the window. The fog had begun to gather in uneven folds along the shoreline. pulling the horizon in toward the land. The bell sounded again, one clear note, then nothing for a time, as though the air itself had to think before repeating it. It seemed to come from inland, though the way sound bent in the fog made direction a fragile guess. The hotel clerk had mentioned no such thing when I arrived. In the ledger downstairs, there had been no handwritten reminders about bells to ignore. Yet the sound was no trick of wind against metal. It had weight, and it seemed to carry with it a fragment of place, as if each note brought a little of where it had been struck. I decided to walk in the morning. The clerk might know, or they might not, but the sound was enough to draw me. Bells are rarely placed without reason, and the inland ones, if that was what they were, would have a reason that was kept, perhaps without being explained. The night passed with the rhythm of the sea pressing softly against the shore. I dreamed, if it can be called that, of moving through low hills under a sky the colour of pewter, the sound of the bell not ahead or behind, but folded into the air around me. In that dream, the walking stick appeared first as a shadow, and then as the outline of a man moving at the edge of vision. I never reached him. When I woke, the fog had thinned, and the day had taken on the same colour as the water, pale, unsure, unchanging. Over tea in the hotel's quiet dining room, I asked the clerk if they knew of any bells kept inland. They paused with a cup in hand, the steam curling upward like a thought reluctant to leave. "Only the old one," they said finally. "It hangs in the belfry at Windlow Crossing. Haven't been rung proper in years. Folks say you can still hear it sometimes on clear days, or in fog thick enough to hide a ship." "Is it far?" I asked. "A walk," they said. "Follow the old post road out of town. It will take you past the marsh and through a stand of alders. The belfry's on a rise beyond." They hesitated, then added, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks. You might find the air carries differently right now." The post road began at the edge of the harbour, where the newer pavement gave way to packed earth and the occasional set of shallow wheel ruts. The marsh was quiet, except for the occasional drip of water falling from reed to pond, the sound magnified in the stillness. Mist hovered above the wet ground, clinging to the edges of the path as though unwilling to be parted from it. The alders closed in gradually, their pale trunks leaning just enough to suggest they were listening. The air there was cooler, and with each step the world behind me seemed to fall further away. The road curved gently, and then I saw it. A low hill rising above the tree line, the faint outline of a wooden frame just visible against the sky. The belfry at Windlow Crossing was older than its timbers suggested. The kind of structure that had been repaired so many times it carried the history of every set of hands that had worked on it. The bell itself hung silent now, its surface mottled with age and weather. The frame swayed slightly in the light wind, though the bell did not move. I stood beneath it for a time, waiting for the sound I had heard the night before. None came. Instead, the breeze shifted, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and, faintly, the distant hiss of water moving over stone. I could almost believe it was the same current I had heard by the cabin, though the river bend was miles from here. On one of the belfry's support beams, carved low enough to be hidden from casual view, was a single word, Greyford. The cuts were shallow, as if made quickly with a small blade. Moss had begun to soften the letters, but they were still legible. I traced them with a fingertip and felt the faint groove where the knife had bitten into the wood. At the base of the hill, a narrow track led away from the belfry toward a cluster of small shuttered buildings. The path was lined with stones that had sunk into the soil at odd angles, suggesting the road had been here far longer than the current village. A weathered signpost at the first fork pointed in two directions. One arrow marked Mill Lane, the other Ferry Road. Neither bore any mention of Windlow or Greyford. I chose Mill Lane, following it past a pair of empty cottages whose windows reflected only the white of the fog. Somewhere behind me, or perhaps from the direction of the marsh, the bell sounded once. I turned, but the hill and belfry was swallowed again by mist. The lane opened into a small square with a dry fountain at its centre. Around it stood 4 buildings: a shuttered shop, what had once been a smithy, a single-story house with a sloping roof, and a narrow inn whose sign creaked faintly on its bracket. I tried the inn's door. It opened without protest. Inside, the air was still and carried the scent of dust and old wood. The counter bore no ledger, no bell to call for service, only a folded scrap of paper weighted by a smooth stone. I lifted the stone and read the note in a neat hand that leaned faintly to the left. Weather hasn't changed in weeks. Leave the key. On a pegboard behind the counter hung 3 keys, each on a length of twine. I replaced the stone, stepped back, and noticed that the wall beside the counter held a narrow shelf. On it sat a single book, small, leather-bound, the cover worn smooth at the corners. The clasp was shut. I did not take it. I only touched the cover lightly, and in doing so saw in the reflection of the inn's small front window a tall figure standing at the edge of the square, a walking stick angled toward the ground. When I turned, the square was empty, except for the slow movement of fog between the buildings. The bell did not sound again that day, but its single note seemed to follow me as I left Windlow Crossing, as though it had been placed in my pocket along with the other things I carried without knowing. The road out of Windlow Crossing sloped gently, following the lay of the land toward low meadows where the grass bent under the same unchanging sky. The mist had thinned, but not in a way that revealed distance, only enough to let the pale outlines of the hills breathe in and out as the light shifted. Each step felt as though it was pulling me just a little further into a place that had been left alone for some time, though never abandoned entirely. A narrow footbridge appeared at the edge of the meadow, spanning a creek that ran fast despite the still air. Its rail was smooth where countless hands had passed, the wood warm in a way that made me pause. On the far side, a wooden post stood with a notice affixed beneath a sheet of warped glass. The ink had faded to near illegibility, but I could just make out a date decades old and a line beneath it. Bells will be sounded for tide changes until further notice. It was the kind of detail that seemed to belong to somewhere else entirely. Tide changes this far inland? I glanced down at the creek, saw the water catch and curl around a half-submerged stone, and for a moment thought I heard a faint answering note from far off, too soft to be the great bell at Windlow. Past the bridge the land began to rise again, the road narrowing between hedgerows where the leaves whispered against each other. Now and then the sound shifted, a rustle here, the dry snap of a twig there, as though something moved just out of view, keeping pace. It was not an unfriendly feeling, only the quiet sense of being noticed by a place rather than the people in it. At the crest of the rise, the hedgerows fell away to reveal a lone structure, a small tower of stone, perhaps once part of a church, though no other building stood nearby. Its door hung open on rusted hinges, and inside the floor was layered with old straw, as if it had been used for shelter by passing animals or travellers caught in weather. There was no bell in this tower now, but a rope dangled from the rafters where one had once hung. The rope's fibres were frayed at the end, the knot above it still tight. Near the rope, resting against the wall, was a long walking stick, simple, weathered, the grain of the wood smooth from years of handling. I reached toward it, then stopped, unsure if touching it would feel like trespass. The stick leaned at just enough of an angle to suggest it had been placed there intentionally, perhaps only moments before. I backed out into the light, and the stillness felt heavier now. As I turned down the road again, a faint movement in the corner of my vision made me glance back. The doorway was empty, the stick gone. The road eventually met the main track again, leading toward a stretch of higher ground where the fog pulled in like a tide against the slopes. From somewhere within it came the bell. Once, twice, each note spaced far enough apart to feel like the breath between lines in a poem. The sound seemed older here, as though it had been rung not for the present, but for something that had already happened. The track led me to a cluster of 3 buildings, their roofs thick with moss. The largest, a long, low hall of grey stone, had a bench outside beneath a narrow overhang. An older man sat there, his cap pulled low, his hands folded on a cane that was not unlike the walking stick I had just seen. He nodded as I approached, the gesture both welcome and acknowledgement. "You heard it, then?" he said, his voice carrying the texture of gravel and weather. "The bell?" "Aye. Not many pay it mind anymore. Used to mark the turning of the tides. Now it rings when it chooses." He looked past me toward the fog. "Sometimes it rings for things we've forgotten about." I asked if anyone still tended it. "No one tends the bell," he said, "but the bell keeps its own watch. That's enough." We sat in quiet for a while. A blackbird landed on the rail nearby, sang a few low notes, and then flew off into the mist. Before I left, the man nodded toward my pack. "You carry a book?" he said. "Yes. Keep it close. Places like this remember better when they're written down." I thanked him, though I hadn't told him about the journal. As I walked away, I could hear the faint creak of his bench as he settled back, his cane still resting across his knees. The track wound downhill toward a valley where the fog was thinner, showing patches of field bordered by old stone walls. Here and there the walls had toppled, the stones lying half buried in grass. A narrow path branched off between 2 such walls, and a signpost at the junction bore a single word carved into its crossbeam: Greyford. The arrow pointed north, though the road in that direction looked no more than a rutted line through the grass. I kept to the main path, but the word lingered, as though simply reading it had placed me on another road entirely. By late afternoon, the light had taken on that quality it gets when the day is thinking about evening, a kind of deepening at the edges. I came to a small clearing where a wooden shelter stood, open on 3 sides. Inside, a bench faced outward toward a stretch of land that sloped gently to a river I did not know. The water moved slowly here, its surface smooth except for the occasional ripple where something passed beneath. On the bench sat another scrap of paper, weighted by a flat stone. I turned it over and saw, in the same left-leaning hand I had come to recognize, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." Beneath it, a small drawing, a bell, its clapper missing. I left the paper where it was. The bell sounded again just before dusk, a single note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It followed me as I took the path along the riverbank toward the hills, the sound fading only when I reached the bend where the water narrowed and disappeared into the trees. There, under the first of the pines, I saw him. The tall figure, coat dark, walking stick angled just so. He was not looking at me. Instead, he seemed to be watching the river, as if waiting for it to speak. When I stepped forward, the space between the trees wavered, and he was gone, leaving only the sound of the water moving over stone and the soft memory of the bell, still carrying somewhere inland. I stood for a while longer before moving on, the light slipping quietly into evening, the weather, as it had for so many days, unchanged. The river path narrowed as it wound deeper into the trees, the water slipping in and out of view between their trunks. The pines here were older, their lower branches stripped bare, so that the canopy above felt like the inside of a quiet, vaulted hall. The air was cooler, touched with the resinous scent of sap, and somewhere far ahead I could hear the low, steady sound of current meeting stone. I walked without hurry, keeping pace with the river's quiet rhythm, until the path rose slightly and brought me to a small clearing where the light fell unbroken. On the far side, set back just enough to be missed if one wasn't looking, stood a cabin. Its roofline sagged in the middle, but not in a way that spoke of neglect, more like a body bending slightly with age. The chimney was cold, the shutters latched, yet on the porch a wooden chair sat angled toward the river, as if someone had just stepped inside. The door was unlatched. I paused, listening, but there was only the hush of the trees and the muted slip of water against the bank. Inside, the air was faintly scented with cedar and smoke, old fire long since gone out. On a small table near the hearth, a kettle rested on its side, the handle polished from years of use. A neat stack of folded blankets sat on the bench beneath the window. It felt less like an abandoned place than one momentarily unoccupied. A single cup sat by the sink, clean and dry. On the mantel, there was a row of objects arranged with quiet care. A river stone smooth as glass, a tarnished compass, a matchbox from a hotel in a coastal town I did not know. Between the compass and the matchbox lay a folded scrap of paper. I opened it. The handwriting, leaning just slightly to the left, was the same I had seen on the notes at the inn and the shelter. Only one line: Greyford, when the water runs quiet. Beneath it, no date, no name. The journal was here too, resting on the corner of the table, the clasp undone. I could not remember leaving it unfastened, though I was certain it had been closed the last time I saw it. The pages lay open to an entry describing the river bend in precise detail, the slope of the bank, the angle of the light, the sound of the water at dusk. In the margin, a faint sketch of the cabin itself, drawn from the perspective of someone standing in this very room. I turned a few pages forward. There were notes on weather, overcast skies, still air, followed by a line I had begun to think of as a refrain. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Outside, the late afternoon light had deepened. The river's surface was unbroken, the current slow enough now to reflect the pale sky. I sat on the porch for a while, listening for the bell, but it did not come. Instead, a different sound reached me, faint, irregular, like the creak of wood under weight. It seemed to come from upstream, from somewhere just beyond the bend where the trees crowded closer to the water. I followed the path until it narrowed to nothing more than a line of flattened grass. The sound grew clearer, not creaking now, but the muffled thud of wood meeting water, as if something heavy shifted against the current. Then I saw it, the edge of a wooden structure emerging from the mist that hung low over the surface. It was a bridge, or what was left of one, its weathered plank suspended between two banks by little more than memory. The far end vanished into fog, the river beneath it moving without urgency. I stepped closer. The boards under my feet were solid enough, though the wood was slick with moss. Halfway across, I stopped. The mist here was thick enough to blur the trees on either bank. The water below was so still it seemed caught between two tides. And then, without warning, a shape formed ahead. A figure, tall, coat dark, walking stick angled toward the planks. I could not see his face. The figure did not move toward me, nor away, only stood as if listening to the quiet. The air between us felt suspended, each second stretching just far enough to hold the weight of what it carried. Then the mist shifted, and he was gone. I crossed the rest of the way, my steps measured, and found myself on a narrow trail that wound uphill. The air grew cooler, and the sound of the river faded until there was nothing but the whisper of leaves in the wind. At the top of the hill, I came upon another bridge, this one whole, though stranger still. It stood without road or track to either side, as if waiting for a path that no longer existed. Its timbers were pale with age, the rails worn smooth. Across the arch, faint letters had been carved, Greyford. I stood at the entrance, one hand on the rail, and felt the way the wood seemed to hold the warmth of every palm that had touched it before. From somewhere far below, or perhaps from the air itself, came a sound. Not a bell this time, but the faint echo of a voice speaking words I could not make out. The bridge, I thought, was listening. The bridge felt older beneath my feet than its pale timbers suggested. Each board gave slightly, not with the looseness of neglect, but with the measured yield of something accustomed to holding weight for a very long time. A faint smell of rain rose from the wood, though the sky had not offered more than a silver haze all day. I took my time crossing, letting my hand slide along the rail. The carvings there were faint, initials, dates, shapes whose meaning had probably been lost to everyone but the person who'd cut them. At the midpoint, where the river opened wider below, the air seemed to grow thicker, as though the bridge itself carried a pocket of weather that didn't belong to the rest of the day. It was here that I heard it again. Not a bell, not the murmur of water, but the slow, deliberate rise of a voice. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, a few syllables at a time, with long pauses in between, as if the speaker were listening for an answer before continuing. I leaned slightly over the rail, looking for the source, but the river below was smooth, unbroken, the kind of stillness that invites reflection without showing much of it. When the voice came again, it was behind me. I turned quickly, but the far end of the bridge was empty, just the long grey planks, the pale handrails, and the fog beginning to pull itself across the arch. Some bridges, I've been told, are not meant to take you from one place to another, but from one moment to another. They hold something in the space between, something that isn't the same once you've stepped off. I walked to the far end, where the path disappeared into a stand of alders. The leaves whispered faintly as the wind moved through, though the air where I stood was still. On the last post before the ground began, someone had pressed a folded slip of paper under a length of twine. I loosened it and opened it in the dim light. 2 lines in the same leftward hand as before. July 14th, tied wrong again. Greyford. No year, no signature. The paper smelled faintly of salt. The path beyond the alders narrowed into a trail barely wide enough for one person, and after a short while it bent downhill toward the sound of running water. Not the broad, patient flow of the river, but the quick, skipping pace of a stream. I followed it until the ground leveled, and there, spanning the water, was another bridge. Or at least it had been. Only the stone footings remained, the timbers long gone, leaving nothing but the water between. On the far bank, a set of stone steps led up to nothing. The mist swirled lightly above it, and for a moment I thought I saw the faint outline of the bridge as it might have been, intact, roofed, the kind that listens. Then the image was gone, and I was left with the ruin and the quiet rush of the stream below. I sat on the steps a while, setting my pack beside me. The journal had shifted inside, its clasp cool against my fingers as I lifted it out. I opened it to a page near the center, and there it was, a sketch of the same broken bridge, drawn from the angle where I now sat. Even the angle of the stones was the same, the water curling around them in identical patterns. In the margin, the single line I had half expected to find. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. I closed the journal and let it rest on my knees. Across the water, through the trees, I could just make out movement, not close enough to see clearly, but the suggestion of someone stepping carefully along a narrow track, tall with the steady balance of a walking stick in hand. The figure stopped for a moment, as if aware of me, though the distance between us made any real recognition unlikely. Then the path bent away, and they were gone. I stayed until the light began to pale toward evening, the fog rising again from the water in long, quiet strands. When I finally stood, the sound of the stream seemed to change, as though it had taken on a new note, one that might, if you listened closely enough, resolve into a bell. The trail from the ruined bridge led me through low fields where the grass was heavy with moisture. Here and there wooden posts leaned at odd angles, their wire fencing long since rusted away. At the far end of the field a road waited, narrow, rutted and edged with the dry stone walls that marked old boundaries. It was on this road that I saw the first sign in some time. a weathered board nailed to a tree, its paint faded to a pale wash. I stepped closer and traced the letters with my eyes. Greyford, 4 miles. The arrow pointed ahead, but the road curved away into a stand of trees before anything could be seen. The name felt less like a destination and more like a reminder, a note to keep it in mind, though not necessarily to arrive there. By the time I reached the curve, the day had dimmed, and the first threads of fog were slipping between the trunks ahead. I could hear water again, not far away, not the stream this time, but the slower pull of a larger current. And then, carried faintly on the air, the creak of wood under weight. I rounded the bend and saw it. Another bridge, roofed, its sides enclosed by vertical planks that left only narrow slits for light. The kind of bridge that could easily hold a voice, or remember one. Its entrance was marked by a single lantern mounted on a post, unlit but still faintly smelling of oil. I stepped inside. The change in sound was immediate. The outside air hushed, replaced by the soft resonance of wood underfoot. My footsteps seemed to belong to someone else in here, as if the bridge were keeping them for later use. I paused halfway across, one hand resting on the railing. In the stillness, a voice rose, not from ahead or behind, but from the wood itself. The words were clear this time, spoken in a tone that was neither welcoming nor warning. "We will not be here when you arrive." The same words from the note in the bottle. I stood very still. The boards beneath me seemed warmer now, though the air was cool. The voice did not come again. At the far end, where the bridge gave way to open road, I found another folded scrap of paper tucked into the frame. This one bore only a drawing, a simple outline of a coastline, an X marked in a small bay. The paper's edges were salt-stiff, as though it had travelled far to get here. I slipped it into the journal and stepped out into the open air, the road ahead disappearing into the fog. Somewhere, not far off, the bell began to sound again, a single patient note, carrying inland through the still weather. The bell's last note faded as I followed the narrow road away from the bridge, its sound settling into the quiet like a stone into deep water. The air here had a different weight to it, cool but not cold, and touched with the faint resin scent of evergreens. Ahead, the road bent gently to the left and then vanished into a wall of tall, straight pines. They stood so close together that the daylight thinned the moment I stepped beneath their canopy. The air became still, the outside world folding in on itself. My footsteps softened against the bed of needles, each one releasing a faint, dry fragrance that made me think of unopened drawers in old houses. The pines rose in long, clean columns, their lower trunks bare, the green only beginning far above. It was here that time began to slip. I could feel it almost immediately, not in the way one notices a clock stopping, but in the way light seems to hold a little too long in one place. My watch still ticked, though the second hand's progress felt detached from the rhythm of my steps. I passed a moss-covered stump, the outline of an old signpost, and then, without realizing it, I passed them again. The air carried no sound beyond my own movement. No birds, no wind, no rustle of undergrowth. Even the river I had left behind seemed to have decided not to follow me here. The road itself remained clear, though narrower now, the pines leaning toward each other at the top, as if exchanging something above my head. I slowed, less from wariness than from the sense that to hurry would be to miss whatever it was the place might be willing to give. At the next bend, a shape emerged in the filtered light, a bench set just off the road, its wood silvered and splintered in places. A single object rested at its center, a black leather-bound journal, clasp fastened. My journal, except my own was in my pack. I picked it up carefully. The leather was cool, the clasp slightly rusted. I turned it over and saw the back bore a faintly etched pattern, concentric circles, each slightly misaligned with the one before it. I had never seen this marking on mine. The clasp opened without resistance. Inside, the handwriting was familiar, left-leaning, measured. The first page was dated with no year, only the month, July. Beneath it a single line, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." The next page held a short entry. "The road bends more than it should. Do not walk quickly." I closed the book and placed it back on the bench. Something in me understood that this was not mine to keep. As I stepped back onto the road, the air shifted, carrying with it a smell I hadn't expected, the salt tang of the coast. The pines thinned without warning, opening to a stretch of low ground where mist hovered just above the earth. In the distance, I could see the outline of another road intersecting mine, marked by a signpost leaning slightly to one side. Its arrow pointed forward, the word Greyford just visible beneath a veil of lichen. Beyond the sign, the road straightened, flanked on either side by rows of birch that looked almost silver in the muted light. Their leaves barely stirred, though a faint sound reached me, the creak of wood like a slow swing in still air. It grew more distinct as I walked, and when I reached the source, I saw it was an old sign hanging from a frame, its letters faded nearly to nothing. Only a few could be read. "Tell, one stays in." The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of lamp oil. And just like that, the pines were behind me, the quiet of their long shadows replaced by the stillness of a broad courtyard, a building rising on the far side, tall with shuttered windows, its roofline softened by years of weather. The hotel looked as though it had been waiting for me, though I had never seen it before. Its door stood open, the interior dim, and somewhere within, I thought I heard the faint click of a walking stick on wooden boards. I stepped into the hotel, the change in light pressing gently against my eyes. The air inside was cooler, holding a trace of salt and polish, as though someone had once kept it immaculate and then quietly stopped. The floorboards yielded with the soft creak of age, the sound travelling ahead of me into the dim hallway. To my right, a reception desk sat empty, though an open ledger lay across it, the ink on its most recent entry still dark. The handwriting leaned to the left in the now familiar way. Greyford, 2 nights. Weather unchanged. No date, no name. The hallway stretched long and straight, lined with closed doors, their numbers dull with tarnish. A faint light pooled at the far end, spilling from a tall window where the curtains had been drawn back just enough to let in the muted grey of the sky. Halfway down, one door stood ajar. I slowed, letting my steps soften, and looked inside. The room was empty except for a single chair placed by the window, facing out toward what I guessed was the coast. A pair of boots rested neatly side by side on the floor beside it, the leather worn smooth at the toes. I waited for some sign that the room belonged to someone still here, but none came. The door opposite was closed. Its number plate was gone, leaving only the shadow of its shape on the wood. The handle turned easily under my hand. Inside, the air was cooler still, as if the room had been sealed for longer than the others. The curtains were drawn, and in the half-light I could make out the shape of a desk near the far wall. Its drawer was shut, but a faint line of dust along the top told me it had been opened recently. I crossed the room and tried it. The drawer slid out smoothly, revealing a single envelope lying flat at the bottom. Inside was a sheet of paper folded twice over. I opened it to find a short message written in the same leftward hand. "We will not be here when you arrive. 14th July. The words were the same as those in the driftwood bottle. Beside the paper lay something small, a pressed sprig of sea heather, pale and brittle, its scent almost gone. I placed it back in the envelope and closed the drawer gently. From somewhere down the hall came the slow, even click of wood on wood, a walking stick on old boards. It was not hurried, nor was it approaching, just the sound of a presence that belonged to the place more than to any one room. I moved to the window and drew back the curtain. Beyond the glass, the courtyard opened toward a slope that fell away to a stretch of pale marsh. The mist was thicker there, but through it I could just make out the faint gleam of water, and far beyond, the darker line of the pines I had walked through. The path seemed to lead away from the marsh, toward higher ground, where the fog pooled in slow, heavy shapes. The sound of the walking stick faded, replaced by the faint groan of the building settling in its frame. I closed the curtain and left the room, the door clicking softly behind me. Downstairs, I found another door at the back of the hallway, its brass knob cold to the touch. It opened onto a narrow set of steps that led down into a stone passage. The air here was damp, carrying the faint scent of standing water. A single light bulb hung from a wire overhead, its glow dim but steady. At the far end of the passage, a smaller door opened outward into the marsh. The sound of the wind was low here, almost absorbed by the water and reeds. A narrow boardwalk stretched out ahead, its planks uneven underfoot, the handrails long since gone. I followed it until the ground beneath began to rise again, leading to a cluster of low buildings with shuttered windows. One stood slightly apart from the others, its door unlatched. Inside I found a single table with a chart spread across it, a tide map, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges. Across the top in pencil, someone had written, "Greyford, ignore tides." I folded the chart and left it where it was. By the time I stepped back onto the boardwalk, the mist had thickened, and the sound of water moving through the reeds had taken on the slow, deliberate cadence of a voice speaking from far away. I followed the boardwalk until it met dry ground, and there, at the edge of the trees, the road began again, narrow, unmarked, leading inland. I glanced back once. Through the fog, the marsh looked almost like the sea on a calm day, its surface smooth, the water holding the grey of the sky. Somewhere within it, I thought I saw the faint outline of a man standing still, walking stick in hand, as if listening. The road ahead curved gently, and with each step the sound of the marsh fell away, replaced by the low rush of wind through the trees. A mile or so on, the first slope of a hill appeared, its sides lined with old stone walls, and there, resting on the wall as though it had been set down only moments before, lay another black leather-bound journal. The journal sat with its spine parallel to the wall, as if placed carefully rather than dropped. The leather was darker than mine, the clasp closed but unfastened, its metal dulled with age. I glanced around. The road was empty, the low stone wall running in either direction without break, the trees behind it close and still. When I lifted the journal, it was lighter than I expected, the pages dry despite the damp air. The first leaf I opened carried a hand-drawn map, not to scale, but sketched with the kind of familiarity that comes from walking the paths yourself. There was a river bend marked in ink, a small square labelled cabin, and to the north a series of looping lines I took to be hills. In the corner, the name Greyford appeared, written twice, as if the writer had hesitated before committing to it. Beneath the map, a single line in that leftward hand, "If you see the gate, you've gone too far." I slid the journal into my pack. The road here was narrow and slightly uneven, the stone walls at my sides breaking now and then to reveal glimpses of fields gone wild. The grass leaned toward me in the wind, though the air itself felt still. It was in the next stretch of trees that I began to notice how the light held itself differently. The sun, or what passed for it in this muted weather, should have been lowering, but the shadows remained where they were, neither lengthening nor fading. I passed a gate of rusted iron set between two leaning posts. The hinges had seized with age, the chain wrapped twice around the bars and hooked in place. I stopped. The journal's warning, "If you see the gate, you've gone too far," pressed gently at the edge of thought. I looked down the road ahead. It curved slightly and then disappeared behind a rise, nothing about it suggesting danger or finality. Still, I turned back. The reverse path felt both familiar and unfamiliar, as if I had been here before, but not in this direction. The stone wall to my left now seemed older, sections having slumped into heaps of moss-covered rubble. It was then that I saw a figure ahead, too far for detail, but tall, coat dark, moving with the steady balance of a walking stick. I quickened my pace, though I knew even as I did that I wouldn't reach him. The road bent once more, and the space ahead was empty. By the time I returned to the place where I'd found the journal, the wall was bare. Only the faint imprint of dust and lichen marked where it had rested. I continued on, and soon the road narrowed further, its surface patchy with grass and loose stone. The trees here leaned closer, their branches crossing overhead in a way that softened the air into something almost tangible. My footsteps seemed quieter than before, the sound of them absorbed by the path itself. After a time, I noticed a faint track leading away from the main road, little more than a line of flattened grass disappearing into the undergrowth. It was not marked on the map in the journal, but something in its angle. The way it seemed to promise a view just out of sight drew me from the road. The track wound gently uphill until the trees opened into a clearing. At its centre stood a weathered signpost, the arms long since lost to decay, leaving only the upright post. A small bench sat nearby, its seat warped but still holding its shape. On it lay a sheet of paper weighted by a river stone. The handwriting was as familiar now as my own. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. I will try the long walk back. There was no date, no name. I folded the paper and placed it in the journal. The clearing was quiet except for the occasional stir of leaves high above. A narrow path led out the far side, sloping down into another stand of pines. I followed it until I heard faintly the rush of water, not the calm current of a river, but something faster, broken by stone. The path emerged at the edge of a gorge, the water below surging white where it struck the rocks. A narrow footbridge crossed here, the boards weathered but sturdy. Halfway across, I stopped and looked down at the water, its sound filling the air so completely that it seemed to erase all else. On the far side, a set of steps climbed to a ridge where a single building stood, small, with a pitched roof, its paint weathered to pale wood. The door was open. Inside there was only a table, a chair, and a single item in the centre of the floor, a walking stick, upright as if balanced by an unseen hand. I did not touch it. Instead, I stepped back outside and looked toward the horizon. The ridge sloped away into a series of low hills, and in the distance I could see the faint glimmer of water. A bay, perhaps, though the light was so even it was hard to tell where sea ended and sky began. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Greyford, or the idea of it. The walking stick stayed where it was as I began the long walk back. The return path felt longer, though the light hadn't shifted. I followed the road until the stone walls gave way to open ground, the grass rolling toward a low rise. From there the land dropped gently to meet a sweep of pale sand, the kind that seemed to hold the footprints of everyone who'd passed for a long while before letting the wind take them. The tide was low, the wet flats stretched far out, glinting faintly under the even sky. Here and there pools of seawater reflected the grey overhead. I stepped down onto the sand, the air holding that faint briny scent that always feels like a memory, even if you've never been here before. I walked along the edge where the sea had last touched, the sand firm underfoot. Bits of driftwood lay scattered, some stripped pale by salt, others still dark with moisture. It was among these that I saw it. Not the same bottle as before, but another, smaller, its glass cloudy and its cork sealed tight with wax. The bottle rocked gently in the thin water left behind by the receding tide. When I picked it up, I felt the weight of paper inside. The wax crumbled under my thumb, and the cork came free with a faint, damp pop. The note within was tightly rolled, the fibres soft with age. I unrolled it carefully. The handwriting leaned left, the ink faded but legible. If you have reached this shore, you are already too late. Greyford, 14th July. Beneath the words was a small sketch, the outline of a bay, an X marked near its mouth. I traced the lines with my finger, trying to match them to any coastline I knew, but it was drawn in a way that left its scale uncertain. It could have been a narrow inlet or a wide harbour seen from a distance. As I stood there, the tide's edge hissed faintly against the sand. Out beyond the flats, a bank of fog began to roll in, low and slow, as if drawn by the pull of the shore. The sound of water shifted, and for a moment it carried with it a single note, not from a buoy or bell I could see, but from somewhere deeper within the fog itself. I slipped the note into the journal and kept walking along the curve of the beach. The sand here was littered with bits of shell, and in one place a stretch of smooth stones that clicked gently underfoot. At the far end, where the land rose again, a narrow stairway of weathered wood climbed toward a bluff. At the top I found a small house, the windows shuttered but the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was still and faintly cool. Dust lay evenly on the floor, except for a single trail, a narrow path of disturbed particles leading from the door to a writing desk by the far wall. The desk's top was clear except for a map, its paper yellowed and its edges curled. It showed a stretch of coastline, hand-drawn in ink, with an X marked in the same place as the one on the note from the bottle. In the bottom corner, in small, slanted script, was written, "Greyford Sound." A soft sound reached my ears then, a creak, like the shifting of wood under weight. I turned, but the room was empty. The light through the shutters was pale, thin. When I looked back at the desk, I noticed a faint indentation in the dust beside the map, as though something had rested there until recently. The shape was long and narrow. The sound came again, now from the hallway beyond the desk. I stepped to the doorway, my hand brushing the frame. The hall was empty, but at the far end near the open back door, a tall figure stood in the muted light, leaning slightly on a walking stick. Before I could speak, the figure turned and stepped outside. By the time I reached the door, there was only the bluff, the path winding down toward the fog that now pressed against the base of the stairs. The tide had begun to shift, the water moving with a slow, deliberate pull back toward the shore. Somewhere within that white curtain, a bell sounded once, and the air felt as though it had been holding its breath for years. The bell's note lingered long after the sound had gone, the way certain scents remain in the air even after their source has passed from sight. I stood at the top of the bluff until the fog thinned enough to reveal the curve of the bay below. The tide was coming in now, but not in the smooth, steady advance I'd grown up knowing. It moved in pulses, a slow forward push followed by a half-hearted retreat, as though it were thinking better of the whole thing. The path down from the bluff wound between scrubby bushes and low, salt-toughened grass, the boards of the stairway damp under my hand. When I reached the sand, I paused to watch the water. The timing of its arrival didn't match the rhythm I had felt on other shores. Here the waves seemed almost distracted, rolling in with a strange hesitation, then pooling at odd angles before drawing back. Farther along the beach, a narrow pier jutted into the bay. Its boards were warped, the pilings darkened with years of salt water. I walked out to the end, where a pair of ropes trailed into the water, their ends tied to nothing. From here I could see how the incoming tide seemed to ripple differently across the surface, small swells cutting against each other at odd intervals. It was less like the moon's pull and more like something shifting far beneath, in no hurry to declare itself. A small shack stood at the shore end of the pier, its door open to the wind. Inside, the air smelled of old netting and tar. Charts were tacked to the walls, neat rectangles of paper now curling at the corners, ink faded but still legible. One chart showed the usual tide cycles for this stretch of coast, but someone had drawn faint lines in pencil over the printed marks, adjusting them to match a different rhythm. At the top of the page, in that now familiar leftward slant, was a note, "Greyford, tables wrong since last summer." A sound outside made me turn, the hollow thump of something bumping against the pier pilings. I stepped to the doorway and looked down. A piece of driftwood, longer than I was tall, rolled slowly in the water, its end knocking against the wood. Caught in a deep split along its surface was a scrap of cloth, pale and fraying. I knelt and worked it free. It was a strip from a larger piece, and though the salt had stiffened it, the inked letters were still clear enough. 14 July by. The water surged unexpectedly then, a single wave pushing higher than the rest. It lapped against the edge of the pier, soaking the boards under my feet before retreating sharply. Out beyond the pier, a darker line moved through the water. Not a shadow from above, but something shifting below, its shape gone before I could hold it in focus. I stepped back inside the shack and let my eyes adjust to the dimness again. In one corner, a crate held a jumble of items. Lengths of rope, a lantern with no glass, a small tin of oil. Resting across the top was a walking stick, its handle worn smooth. I touched it lightly, and for a moment thought I felt the faint vibration of the pier through it, as if it were listening to the movement of the tide. When I set it back, I noticed a second journal at the bottom of the crate. Black leather, smaller than mine, the clasp held shut with twine. I didn't untie it, only turned it over in my hands. The back bore the same faint pattern of concentric circles I had seen on the journal, left on the bench in the whisper pines. I left the shack and followed the shoreline toward the far side of the bay, where the land curved sharply and the rocks took over from sand. Here the tide's odd behavior was even more pronounced. Water pooling high among the stones, while the lower flats stayed nearly dry, then shifting in the opposite way a few minutes later. The rocks glistened with moisture even where no wave had touched them. Climbing higher on the slope, I found a spot where the whole bay spread out below. The pattern in the water was clearer from here. Not random, but not the lunar rhythm I knew. It was as if two separate tides were moving at once, one answering to the moon, the other to something else entirely. Behind me, the path continued along the cliff edge. I followed it until I came to a point where the ground leveled into a grassy plateau. At its center stood a weathered post, the remains of a sign nailed to it. Only one word remained legible beneath the peeling paint: Greyford. As I stood there, the bell sounded again. A single note, far away, carried on air that had no wind in it. The bell's note faded into the still air, leaving only the faint hush of water against the distant rocks. I turned from the plateau and followed the inland path, the grass thinning as the soil beneath grew darker, more compact, as though the ground here had seen more footsteps than the cliff edge ever did. The sea's scent lingered a while, then gave way to the cooler smell of river water long before I heard it. The path narrowed between older trees, their roots snaking through the earth in tangled lines. Somewhere ahead I caught a glimmer of movement, water flowing slow, catching the muted light. The river was wide here, not fast, its surface broken only by the occasional drift of leaves. A curve in the bank revealed the cabin. It sat just far enough back from the water to be spared the reach of floods, its porch facing the bend where the current seemed to pause before deciding which way to go. The roof was steep, the wood grey with age but well kept. One shutter hung slightly open, swaying in the faintest of breezes. As I stepped onto the porch, the boards answered with a low creak. The door was closed but not latched, and it opened easily under my hand. The air inside was warmer than I expected. The faint scent of old firewood lingering beneath the sharper note of river mud. A single window framed the view of the bend, the water holding its slow turn in the same way a breath can be held just a moment longer than needed. Against the far wall stood a desk. Its surface was bare except for a black leather-bound journal, the clasp open. I hesitated before touching it. I had found enough of these to know they were rarely just notebooks. When I opened it, the first page showed a drawing of the river bend, shaded with careful lines, the cabin sketched in the foreground. Beneath it, in the same leftward script, "When the water stops, so will we." The next page was dated 14th of July. No year. It held a few lines about weather, overcast, unmoving, followed by the phrase I'd seen too many times to ignore: "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." From the porch came a sound, faint, deliberate, the tap of wood against wood. I turned toward it, but the space outside was empty, save for the alder shadows. The sound came again, this time from the riverbank. I stepped outside and followed it down to where the ground softened near the water. There, leaning against a smooth boulder, was a walking stick. Long, weathered, its handle worn pale. It stood as though it had been placed there for someone to find. Across the river, a figure moved among the trees. Tall, coat dark, the stick in his hand catching a line of light before he stepped into shadow. He did not look my way, but I had the distinct sense he knew I was watching. The river's surface shivered, and the current shifted, not in its usual steady turn, but in a slow backflow, the kind I'd seen near the strange tides at the coast. For a moment, the bend held entirely still, the water reflecting the trees with an unnerving clarity. Then the current resumed, as if nothing had happened. I turned back toward the cabin. The journal lay open where I had left it, but now the page had changed. In place of the river sketch was a map, not of the bend, but of a series of winding paths leading inland. At their center, in small careful letters, was written, "Greyford." Beneath it, another line, "Follow only when the bell calls twice." The air felt heavier then, as though the cabin were listening for something. I closed the journal, fastened the clasp, and left it where it had been. By the time I stepped back onto the porch, the figure across the river was gone. The water held its steady turn again, and somewhere beyond the trees, so faint it could almost be mistaken for wind, came the sound of a bell, a single note, waiting for its echo. The bell that called twice. The first note still hung in the air, faint enough to be mistaken for memory, when the second came. It was softer than the first, almost as if it had travelled farther to reach me. The sound seemed to move through the trees rather than over them, brushing against the alder trunks before settling into the slow bend of the river. I stepped down from the porch, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and followed the sound. The path along the bank narrowed, the ground softening until I had to step carefully between patches of moss. Every so often, the river would open into small inlets where the water stilled just enough to reflect the branches overhead. The bell sounded again, 2 notes close together this time, though I could not tell if they were nearer or farther. The path eventually bent sharply away from the water, leading uphill into a cluster of tall pines. The ground was springy with needles, the air holding that resin-heavy scent I had first noticed in the whisper pines. At the top of the slope stood a structure, not a tower as I might have expected, but a low, weathered building with its roof bowed gently in the middle. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was still and cool, the light filtering through narrow slits between the boards. At the center of the room hung a single bell, suspended from a beam, its rope coiled neatly on the floor. A journal rested on a small table nearby. The black leather cover was cracked at the corners, the clasp fastened. When I opened it, the first page held nothing but a date, 14th of July. The second page contained the words, "When it calls twice, follow the western path." From outside came the faint crunch of footsteps on pine needles. I looked through the doorway, but the trees beyond were empty. Only when I stepped into the light did I see movement. Far down the slope, near the water's edge, the tall figure moving steadily, walking stick in hand. He did not look back. The western path began just beyond the bell house, marked by 2 leaning posts that might once have held a gate. It was narrower than the riverbank trail, the undergrowth pressing close, and it carried me deeper into the forest than I had gone before. The air grew cooler, the light dimming until the path opened unexpectedly onto a clearing where the grass grew long and wild. At its centre stood a bench, and on it a folded scrap of paper weighed down by a smooth river stone. The paper bore only one line. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." I put it into my journal without unfolding it further, though I had the sense there might be more written on the reverse. The path out of the clearing was faint, almost hidden, but it carried the smell of running water, and I followed it until the sound of the river returned. There, across the current, stood a footbridge I had not seen before, its planks worn but sturdy, the railings smooth from long use. In the middle of the span, a small bell hung from a simple wooden frame. It did not move in the still air, but as I stepped onto the bridge it rang once, then again, though no hand had touched it. The house at the edge of the marsh. The far end of the bridge led into low ground where the trees grew sparse, the roots of some exposed and twisted in the soft soil. The scent of salt returned, faint at first and then sharper as the land sloped toward the marsh. Pools of standing water reflected the pale sky, and here and there narrow channels wound their way toward the unseen coast. A narrow track, little more than packed mud, led me through the reeds to a small rise of dry ground where a house stood alone. Its walls were grey with weather, the windows shuttered, but the door swung loosely in the breeze. Inside, the light was dim, the air holding the scent of old rope and something faintly metallic. On a table near the window lay another map. This one showed the marsh in careful detail, channels, pools, narrow ridges of dry land. An X marked a point not far from where I stood. Beside it, in the margin, was written, "Greyford line, avoid high tide." A second sheet lay beneath the map, half covered in sketches of water patterns, loops and eddies that seemed to form where the marsh met the river. At the bottom of the page, the words slanted left in that same script, "4th July, the tide moved without the moon." From outside came the sound of a footstep on the porch, slow, deliberate, the creak of weight shifting on old wood. I turned toward the door, but the porch was empty. Beyond it, the reeds swayed faintly, though the air itself was still. The path continued past the house, skirting the edge of the marsh until it reached a narrow causeway of stone. On the far side, the land began to rise again, and I followed the winding path upward until the scent of salt faded, replaced once more by the cooler smell of inland air. At the crest of the hill, I looked back. The marsh spread out in quiet stillness, the water holding the muted light. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the roof of the house, walking stick in hand, but when I blinked, the roof was empty. The road before Greyford. The inland path joined a broader road, its surface worn smooth by years of travel. Stone markers appeared now and then at the edge, most too weathered to read, though one still bore a faint carving, an arrow pointing forward and the word Greyford beneath it. The light was softer here, the air carrying the faint scent of grass after rain, though I had not seen rain in weeks. A mile or so on, the road passed a small grove of birch trees, their pale bark catching what light there was. Beneath them stood a low stone wall, and resting atop it was yet another journal, black leather, the clasp undone. Inside, the first page held only a phrase, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." The next few pages were blank, but halfway through, a single map appeared, not of rivers or marshes, but of the road itself, winding toward a point marked simply, "Gate." As I closed the book, the sound of a bell drifted faintly through the air. 2 notes close together. They came from farther up the road, somewhere just beyond the next bend. I set the journal back on the wall and followed the sound, each step carrying me closer to whatever waited before Greyford. When I reached the bend, the road stretched empty ahead, but in the distance, at the crest of the next rise, a figure stood motionless, leaning slightly on a walking stick. The light behind him made his features impossible to see, and before I could take another step, he turned and vanished over the hill. The bell did not sound again. The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, thin and steady, as if the sky had decided on a single note and held it without variation. In the upper reaches of the old coast road, where the land rose and curved away from the sea, there was a small inn with a faded red sign swinging above its door. Few stayed there now. The rooms were draughty, and the paint along the window frames had peeled to soft curls. But it was the only place for many miles where the lamps burned late, and the sound of the tide could be heard through the floorboards. A young woman arrived on the 3rd evening, her coat dripping and her hair wind-blown. She asked for a room in a quiet voice, glancing behind her once before stepping fully inside. The innkeeper, a woman with a lined face and a tendency to speak in half-sentences, gave her a brass key that had been polished so often it looked out of place among the rest. Later, as the rain whispered against the glass, the woman unpacked. Among her few belongings was a small black leather-bound journal, its corners worn pale from years of handling. She set it on the bedside table without opening it. Outside, the air smelled of salt and wet stone. That night she dreamt of a town she did not know. Grey rooftops, a river that wound like a length of dark ribbon, and a bridge made of iron where a tall man with a walking stick stood watching her from the far end. His face was in shadow, but his posture was one of patient waiting. When she woke, she found the window open. The rain had stopped, but the room was cool, and on the sill lay a folded scrap of paper. It bore only 6 words, written in neat block letters. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." She looked toward the door, then back to the note. Something in her chest felt heavier than fear, a quiet recognition, as if she'd been reminded of a promise she had once made and forgotten. She dressed slowly that morning, the note still lying on the sill. The handwriting was careful, as though whoever had written it had been mindful of time, each letter drawn with deliberate weight. She tucked it between the last page of the journal and the back cover without reading any of the previous entries. Outside, the inn's narrow corridor smelled faintly of damp wood and boiled tea. The dining room was quiet, save for the rhythmic scrape of the innkeeper's spoon stirring a pot. The only other guest was an older man in a dark coat, his hat resting on the chair beside him. He sat near the window, where a thin blade of light pressed through the lace curtains, and though he faced the street, his eyes seemed fixed on something much farther away. The young woman took a seat at the far end, feeling the way one might in a nearly empty church, obliged to keep a certain stillness. She asked for tea. As the cup was set before her, she noticed the older man had turned slightly, not enough to meet her gaze, but enough for her to feel the shift. After a few minutes, the innkeeper spoke as if addressing neither of them in particular. "Roads washed out past Greyford," she said, pausing as if the name carried weight. "Best stay put until the crews come through." The woman's fingers tightened around the cup. She didn't know the place, yet the words seemed to pull at her memory, like the faint scent of something half forgotten. She finished her tea and stepped outside. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the air heavy and low, the sky a single stretch of pale grey. She followed the curve of the coast road until the inn was out of sight. The ground here was soft and uneven, marked by shallow pools that reflected the sky. She found herself at a small rise where the land opened to a view of the water. There, in the distance along the shoreline, she saw him. A tall figure, still as a post, leaning slightly on what could only be a walking stick. The wind caught the hem of his coat, but he didn't move. She couldn't see his face, only the shape of him against the muted sea. By the time she reached the bend in the road that would have brought her closer, he was gone. That night she opened the journal for the first time in days. The earliest entries were in another hand entirely. The ink faded to a pale brown. Notes on towns she didn't recognize, brief sketches of shorelines, fragments of phrases. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. And one more, in the same precise script as the note on her sill. If you see him, do not follow. She read until the lamplight began to waver, the faint hiss of the wick telling her it would soon go out. Somewhere outside, a shutter banged softly, not with the violence of a storm, but with the gentle insistence of a tide that never recedes entirely. She closed the journal and set it back on the table. Sleep did not come easily. Every time her eyes began to close, she saw the figure again, unmoving on that stretch of shoreline. She wondered how far the tide had come in since she last saw him, whether the water would have reached his boots. The image would not fade, and by the time the faint, pale light of dawn began to show in the window, she had not truly slept. Downstairs, the innkeeper was speaking to the older man in low tones. Their voices fell silent when she entered. The man rose, adjusting his hat, and stepped outside without a word. The innkeeper poured her tea and said, almost as an afterthought, "You're not from here, are you?" "No," the young woman replied. The innkeeper nodded slowly. "Best not wander too far along the shore, not these days." She returned to her stirring, the conversation apparently ended. After breakfast, the young woman walked inland away from the sea. The land dipped into a hollow where the air felt cooler, and here she found a narrow path lined with gorse and tangled bramble. It led to a disused railway line, the tracks long since lifted, leaving only the dark bed of stone and the faint memory of where the rails had been. She followed it until the path curved and brought her to an old station house. Its roof sagged, and the windows were black with grime. On the outer wall, half hidden by ivy, was a map in a weathered frame. Most of the place names were faded beyond recognition, but one remained sharp enough to read: Greyford. She traced the route with her finger. The map showed the line continuing past Greyford into an area marked only by a pale wash of blue, as though water had claimed it. A rustle behind her made her turn. The older man from the inn was standing a short distance away, his dark coat buttoned high, his walking stick held loosely in one hand. For a moment, she thought it was the man from the shoreline, but the face was different, lined, sharp-eyed, entirely present. "You've been looking in the wrong direction," he said quietly. Before she could speak, he tipped his hat and walked away down the overgrown track. She stood there for a long while after the man's departure, her breath clouding faintly in the cool air. His words, simple as they were, seemed to have taken root in her, looking in the wrong direction. It made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite say why. She traced the route on the map once more before turning back toward the inn, the steady hush of the sea now muted by the folds of the land. By the time she returned, the afternoon light had dimmed to that strange, colourless tone that comes before an early dusk. The air was heavy again, as if the rain had only been resting between bouts. She set the journal on the table in her room and opened it to a page near the middle. The entry was short, a date from several years ago, and beneath it, the line past Greyford was gone by then. All the rest followed soon after. The handwriting was the same precise, almost old-fashioned style she'd seen on the note, though the ink here was darker, fresher, as if it had been written more recently than the date suggested. She closed the book when she noticed the lamplight trembling again. This time she kept the curtains drawn. That night, the dream returned. She was walking the shoreline, the tide lapping high, when she saw him again. Tall, still, the walking stick angled lightly in his grip. The sound of the waves was strangely muted, as though they were breaking somewhere far away. She tried to call out, but the air was thick, her voice carrying no farther than her own ears. He turned slightly, just enough for her to see that his coat was unbuttoned and his other hand rested on something in his pocket. Then he began to walk away, not toward the town, not inland, but toward a place where the water seemed to fold back upon itself like fabric being gathered. When she woke, the window was closed, but there was another note on the sill. This one bore only 4 words: "Do not take the train." The station house had been abandoned for years. She knew that much. But still, the warning sat in her chest like a weight. She kept to the inland paths the next day, but it was as though the coast drew her, no matter her intent. She passed the railway bed again, followed it without meaning to, and came once more to the station house. This time the older man was waiting. He leaned on his stick, the brim of his hat casting his face in shadow. "Thought you might come back," he said. "You're not the first." He stepped aside, revealing that the door to the station house was ajar. The air inside smelled of old paper and damp timber. A bench sat along one wall, and in the corner under a sheet of cracked glass was a timetable. Most of the paper had yellowed to near illegibility, but one entry was still clear: a train departing for Greyford at dawn, returning at dusk. The year was wrong. It was decades in the past. "No one takes it now," the man said quietly, "but sometimes you can hear it." The way he said it made her skin prickle. She was about to ask what he meant when a sound reached her, a faint metallic hum like rails singing under distant weight. It rose almost imperceptibly, then faded again. "Don't follow it," the man said, "even if you think you recognize someone." The following morning, she woke before the sun. The note was gone from the sill, though she had not moved it. She checked the journal, but the pages seemed unchanged. She tried to remember the route she had traced on the map, but all she could recall was the blue wash beyond Greyford. The day stayed grey, the air pressing close, and she found herself walking without deciding where to go. The road curved inland, dipped beneath a line of wind-twisted trees, then opened onto a view she had not seen before: the river. It was wide here, its surface a sheet of dark glass. Somewhere far upstream she could hear the rush of water over stone. A figure stood on the bridge, tall, unmoving, the walking stick held lightly in one hand. She thought of the older man from the inn, but even from this distance she knew it was not him. She stepped onto the path leading down to the water, but when she reached the bridge the figure was gone. Only the faintest damp footprints remained on the worn planks. At the center of the bridge she paused. Below her the river moved with slow determination, and there, caught against one of the stone piers, was something small and dark. She climbed down to the bank, the earth soft beneath her boots. It was another journal. Black leather, worn, the corners softened by years. She opened it to the first page and found only a single line: "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." She turned the small black book in her hands, the leather cool and damp from the river water. There was no name on the inside cover, no dates, no clue as to who it might have belonged to. Just the single sentence, written in that same measured, deliberate hand. She flipped through the rest of the pages. Most were blank, but every so often she found another line or two, always in the same ink and with the same precise script. "Do not wait at the platform. Do not follow if called. The weather hasn't changed in weeks." The last entry was near the middle, as if the rest of the book had never been needed. It read, "If you arrive, you must not speak." She closed the journal and held it against her side, staring out at the river. Somewhere above her, the clouds shifted just enough for a pale gleam of light to fall across the water. It seemed to deepen the color rather than brighten it. She made her way back to the inn by a different route, following a narrow track through fields that had long since gone to seed. The grasses brushed her legs, whispering as she passed. Once she thought she saw someone ahead on the path, a man in a long coat, leaning slightly as he walked, but when she reached the bend, the track was empty. At the inn, the older man was sitting in the same seat by the window, hat tilted back just enough to show the narrow lines at the corners of his eyes. He looked at the damp journal in her hand, and for the first time his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something like recognition dulled by time. "You found it," he said quietly. "Do you know who it belongs to?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." Before she could ask what that meant, he rose, set a few coins on the table, and stepped out into the dim street. The innkeeper appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She glanced at the book and frowned. "Best not to keep that," she said. "It's been found before." The fire in the hearth snapped softly, filling the silence that followed. The young woman took the journal upstairs. She set it beside her own on the table and looked between them. They were nearly identical in size and colour, though hers was older, the leather worn pale at the edges. That night she dreamt not of the shoreline or the bridge, but of a railway platform under a heavy sky. The air was still, the light flat and colourless. She stood among a small group of people, their faces turned toward the horizon. In the distance she heard the hum of metal on metal. Someone at her side said, "It's late today." When the train arrived, its carriages were dark, the windows reflecting only the grey of the sky. A tall man stepped down, leaning on his walking stick. He looked directly at her, though his face was lost in shadow. Then he nodded toward the open door of the carriage. She did not move. The next morning she found the window open again. The note on the sill bore only 3 words: "Do not board." The days blurred after that. The weather remained unchanged, the light shifting only slightly from dawn to dusk. She kept mostly indoors, though sometimes the pull of the coastline would draw her out. Each time, she half expected to see him there, standing at the edge of the water or on the far side of the bridge. One evening, she walked the old railway bed until she reached a point where the path was washed away. The stones fell away into a shallow gully, the far side overgrown and unreachable. She turned back, but halfway along the track she heard it again, that faint metallic hum, rising and falling like something moving at a distance. The older man appeared from a gap in the trees ahead, his walking stick tapping softly against the stones. "It's close tonight," he said, as though speaking to himself. "Where does it go?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "It doesn't matter where, only that it doesn't come back." The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt and wet iron. The hum faded, and he turned away without another word. The journal from the river lay unopened on her table for days. When she finally opened it again, she found a new line written at the bottom of the first page. "You are already on the platform." She shut it quickly, her pulse unsteady. The rain had begun again outside, a thin, endless fall that blurred the view beyond the glass. She lit the lamp and tried to write in her own journal, but the words would not come. Every sound seemed sharper, the hiss of the flame, the creak of the floorboards, the soft shuffle of someone passing in the hall. When she opened the door, the corridor was empty, but at the far end, near the stair, a wet footprint marked the wood. It faced her door. That night she did not dream. By the end of the week she knew she could not stay. The road past Greyford had reopened, and the innkeeper made no effort to hide her relief when the young woman asked about hiring a driver. "Best to leave early," she said, "before the weather changes." The phrase caught in the young woman's mind, but she said nothing. She packed both journals into her bag and went to bed early. Sometime in the night, she woke to the sound of a whistle, low, distant, and unmistakably from the direction of the old railway. She lay still, listening, until the sound faded. When she left the next morning, the older man was nowhere to be seen. The innkeeper stood in the doorway, watching as the car pulled away. The road wound inland, the sea falling out of sight, but she could not shake the sense that she had not truly left. Somewhere in her bag, between the worn covers of the journals, the words seemed to wait. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." The road away from the coast unfurled in slow, unhurried bends, climbing through low hills where the grass grew in uneven patches, broken by stretches of bare earth. The air seemed warmer here, though the sky was still washed of colour, a flat grey that made it hard to tell the time of day. The driver, a man with pale hair and a voice as quiet as the wind through reeds, kept his eyes on the road and spoke only once. "You'll pass through Greyford if you keep along this way." The name seemed to echo in the space between her thoughts, carrying with it the faint memory of the map at the station house and the blue-washed land beyond. She asked if Greyford was far. "Not far," the driver said, "but most don't stop." They reached a point where the road narrowed, passing between two old stone markers that looked as though they had once been part of a gate. Beyond them, the land sloped into a shallow valley. A river cut through the middle, and on its banks the town of Greyford waited, its rooftops dull and wet-looking, its streets empty of movement. The car slowed as they passed a row of shuttered shops. A faded sign for a cafe swung gently in the wind, though no lights burned inside. She caught the scent of the river, cool, metallic, and faintly sweet, like water drawn from a deep well. At the edge of the square, the driver stopped. "This is as far as I go." She stepped out, the sound of her boots echoing briefly in the still air. The car turned and disappeared the way it had come, leaving her in the quiet heart of the town. She began to walk without any clear destination. The buildings here seemed preserved in some suspended moment, paint worn to pale layers, windows clouded from within, doors with handles darkened by years of touch. The river followed her on one side, its current slow but constant. She crossed a narrow footbridge, pausing at its crest. On the far bank, a figure stood just at the edge of her vision. Tall, coat dark, walking stick held in one hand. He did not move, even as the wind stirred the water below. She looked away for only a moment, and when she turned back, the spot was empty. In a small square beyond the bridge, she found a bench beneath an old iron lamp-post. She sat, the journal still in her bag, and watched the slow drift of clouds overhead. A faint ringing reached her ears, distant, metallic. She thought of the station house, the timetable, the hum of rails. A woman emerged from a narrow doorway nearby, her hair bound in a faded scarf. She looked at the stranger on the bench for a moment before speaking. "You've come too late," she said softly. The young woman asked what she meant. "They've already gone," the woman replied, glancing toward the river. "The last train left days ago." She wanted to say that the railway had been gone for years, but something in the woman's tone kept her silent. Instead she asked, "Where did it go?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "Beyond the water, beyond the weather." Before she could ask anything more, the woman turned back into the shadowed doorway and closed it behind her. The river's path led her to the edge of the town, where the land flattened into a stretch of reeds and pale stones. Here the air felt heavier, carrying the faint hiss of distant water breaking on rock. She thought she could see the outline of the coast far to the west, though the light played tricks, making distances uncertain. She stopped when she noticed something dark half buried in the stones, a piece of leather, worn and torn along one edge. When she pulled it free, she saw the binding of yet another small black journal, its pages swollen with damp. Inside, the ink had run in most places, but a few words remained clear. "You were seen on the bridge." She turned, scanning the empty stretch behind her. Only the reeds moved, whispering in the wind. The walk back into town felt longer, the streets quieter than before. She found an inn near the square, smaller than the one by the coast, but warm with the scent of wood smoke. The man at the desk gave her a key without asking for her name, as though he had been expecting her. In her room, she laid all three journals on the table. Side by side, they seemed almost identical, each with its own handful of words, its own warnings. She wondered if there were more, scattered along the riverbanks, tucked into the corners of forgotten buildings, carried away by the tide. That night, she did not dream of the platform. She dreamt instead of walking through the streets of Greyford, the lamps unlit, the sound of footsteps following her in time with her own. She did not turn to see who it was. When she woke, there was a note on the floor by the door. The paper was thin, the ink faint, but the words were clear. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Morning in Greyford was without colour. The light that filtered through the curtains carried no warmth, only a pale diffusion that made the edges of the furniture seem softer, less defined. She rose slowly, her steps muted by the worn rug, and stood for a long moment at the window. The river was visible from here, a long thread of slate-grey weaving between the rooftops. It seemed to move slower than the water she had known by the coast, as though time itself had taken on a different pace in this place. Downstairs the inn was empty. The desk stood unattended, a single ledger lying open to a blank page. She called out once, but her voice fell flat, the sound swallowed by the stillness. She stepped outside, the cool air carrying the faint scent of wet stone. Greyford's streets curved gently toward the water, their paving uneven with age. Here and there, windows were open, but no one looked out. She thought again of the woman she'd met the day before, the one who had said she was too late. The riverbank drew her on, its surface mirroring the sky. At the edge of the bridge she paused. The planks were damp beneath her hand, worn smooth by years. She thought of the words in the river journal, "You were seen on the bridge." Halfway across she stopped. On the far bank, leaning against the railing, stood the tall man. His coat was buttoned to the throat, his hat casting his face in shadow. The walking stick rested lightly in his hand. For a moment they regarded one another across the span. A soft sound broke the silence, a whistle, faint and distant. It was the same note she had heard from the coastal inn, but now it carried a depth, as though it came from somewhere both far and near. The man on the bridge did not move, but she saw his fingers tighten on the stick. When she took a step forward, he turned and walked away. She crossed quickly, but the street beyond was empty. Only a narrow alley opened between two buildings, and at its far end a door stood ajar. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and oil. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with ledgers and maps. On a central table lay a large sheet covered in faded ink. It was a map of the railway line, though this one was more detailed than the one at the station house. The route passed through Greyford, then continued into the blue-washed land she had seen before. In the corner of the map, in a hand she now recognized instantly, were the words, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." She traced the line with her finger, following it into the blue. The ink grew lighter there, the marks less precise, until the track ended in nothing at all. A sound made her look up. The tall man was standing in the doorway, watching her. He said nothing, but his presence filled the space like a held breath. "What's beyond the blue?" she asked. He stepped forward, the tip of his walking stick tapping softly against the floor. "It's not for you," he said, his voice low and measured. The whistle sounded again, closer now, and he glanced toward the window. "It's early today." When she looked back at the map, the blue-washed section seemed larger than before. The whistle lingered in her ears long after she left the building. The streets of Greyford felt subtly changed, though she could not say how. Shadows seemed to fall differently, and the river's current had taken on a strange, steady rhythm, like breathing. She returned to the inn and found the ledger on the desk now contained her name. She did not remember writing it. Beside it, in smaller script, was a note, "Departure pending." That night, she dreamt of the railway platform again. This time, it was crowded, though no one spoke. The tall man stood at the far end, his face still hidden, the walking stick held before him like a barrier. The train approached, its carriages gleaming dully in the flat light. As it slowed, she saw that the doors bore no handles, only smooth panels of dark metal. A voice beside her whispered, "If you arrive, you must not speak." She woke with the sound of the whistle still in her mind, and the sense, impossible but certain, that she had returned from somewhere she had not intended to go. The following day came without a sunrise. The pale light seemed to arrive all at once, settling over Greyford in an even layer, as though someone had drawn a curtain and forgotten to let it fall again. She left the inn without eating, her steps carrying her instinctively toward the bridge. The river was higher now, its surface broken by swirls and faint eddies. Standing at the midpoint, she looked down and saw, caught against the pilings, something dark and rectangular. She climbed down the embankment, the stones slick beneath her boots, and pulled it free. Another journal. This one was in better condition than the one she'd found by the reeds. The pages were dry, the leather firm. Inside, the handwriting matched the others exactly. The first entry was only 2 words. It waits. The rest of the pages were blank, save for a single line near the end. When you see the light, follow. She slipped it into her bag beside the others and climbed back up to the bridge. Across the river, near the foot of a narrow street, she saw him again, the tall man, standing motionless, watching. The wind caught the hem of his coat, but he didn't move. When she crossed to where he had stood, the street was empty. Only the sound of the river remained. She wandered through the quieter lanes of Greyford, where the buildings leaned toward one another and the cobblestones were uneven underfoot. In one window she saw the reflection of the street behind her, but the figure in it was not her own. It was taller, with the outline of a walking stick in hand. When she turned, there was no one there. Near the edge of town she came upon a small building with a sign so faded it was unreadable. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. A single bench sat against the wall, and opposite it, a ticket window stood empty. Behind the glass, a sheet of yellowed paper hung crooked. It was a schedule, though the year was decades old. Only one route was listed, Greyford to an unnamed destination. Under return, the column was blank. She leaned closer. At the bottom of the paper, written in the same careful hand as the journals, were the words, "Do not wait at the platform." That night she couldn't sleep. The wind rattled softly at the shutters, and somewhere in the distance she heard the whistle again, low and drawn out, lingering in the stillness. She got up, dressed, and slipped outside. The streets of Greyford were deserted. The lamps, though unlit, seemed to give off a faint glow, enough to guide her to the far edge of town where the remnants of the old railway line began. The stones underfoot were slick, the air damp with a scent she couldn't place, like rain on iron. The whistle sounded again, closer now. Ahead, the darkness seemed to shift, and a faint, steady light appeared, suspended at the level of her eyes. It pulsed gently, in time with the hum of the rails she could no longer see. She thought of the line in the newest journal, "When you see the light, follow." Her steps carried her forward. The light seemed to recede as she approached, drawing her deeper along the vanished line. Somewhere in the distance she heard footsteps, measured and deliberate. The hum grew louder, and then suddenly the platform was there, whole, intact, and bathed in that same colourless light she had seen in her dreams. A handful of figures stood waiting, their faces obscured by the dimness. At the far end, the tall man rested on his walking stick, watching her. The train slid into view without a sound. Its carriages gleamed faintly, the doors seamless and without handles. The air shifted as it stopped, carrying with it a scent like the river before a storm. The man straightened, his shadow stretching along the boards toward her. "It's time," he said. She remembered the warnings. Do not board. Do not follow if called. But the light from the open door was unlike anything she had ever seen, warm and deep and endless. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of the journals inside. She took a single step forward. She stood at the edge of the platform, the light spilling toward her like a tide, soft and slow, yet pulling with undeniable strength. The tall man watched without expression, his hand resting lightly on the head of his walking stick. The other figures waiting near the train remained still, their faces hidden in the half-light. Her thoughts moved strangely, as if slowed by the weight of the moment. She remembered each of the journals, the warnings, the instructions, the repetitions of Hov. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. She thought of the river and the bridge, the notes left on the sill, the empty streets of Greyford. The light seemed to breathe. "You don't have to," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet that seemed older than the town itself. "But if you turn away, you will always wonder." She looked past him at the carriages. The doors still had no handles, yet now one of them stood open. Inside, the light was not uniform. It shifted and deepened, as though it led to somewhere far beyond the small space it should have contained. A faint wind rose, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant water. For an instant she thought she saw the reflection of herself in the polished surface of the train, but the figure looking back was older, her hair threaded with grey, the journal still in her hands. Her fingers brushed the edge of the newest journal. "When you see the light, follow." She stepped forward, just enough for her foot to cross the threshold of the open door. The air changed immediately, warmer and sharper, and she could hear far away the sound of water over stone. The tall man inclined his head, neither smiling nor frowning, and tapped his walking stick once on the platform. The door closed without a sound. From outside, the train began to move, its wheels silent on rails that no longer existed. The figures on the platform faded back into the stillness of Greyford, their shapes dissolving into the pale air. The light from within the train dimmed until it was no longer visible from the valley. And in the quiet that followed, the weather did not change. For a long time after the train vanished into the distance, the platform stood empty. The pale light thinned, and the colourless sky settled back over Greyford as though nothing had happened. Only the faintest echo of the whistle lingered, drifting over the rooftops until it, too, was gone. The journals remained on the small table in her room at the inn, each closed, each unmarked since she had last touched them. Yet when the innkeeper stepped inside to tidy, she found all three lying open to different pages. Each page bore the same new line in the same deliberate hand. "She has boarded." By evening, word had passed quietly among the few in Greyford who still noticed such things. The older man was seen walking along the riverbank at dusk, his stick tapping softly in the still air. He paused at the bridge, looking out across the water as if waiting for something to return. The night settled in without rain, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt different. Lighter, but edged with a restlessness that had not been there before. Down by the reeds at the river's bend, a single drop of water struck the surface, sending ripples across the glassy current. Then another. By dawn, a thin mist had gathered over the town, and the people who woke early enough swore they smelled the sea, though Greyford lay far inland. And in the quiet just before the first light touched the river, a sound came faint and uncertain, like the whisper of distant rails, rising and fading, as though the weather itself was preparing to change.